This clown suit belonged to serial killer Wayne Gacy. He would dress up as Pogo the Clown and perform for children at children's hospitals and other charitable events. It's eerie seeing these costumes in person. Wayne Gacy murdered an estimated 33 boys and men, but his true victim count is still unknown. All of these items that I'm showing on screen belonged to Wayne Gacy at one point, either inside or outside of prison. And it's absolutely eerie to be standing right in front of the killer clown himself. We're actually covering this story on our podcast Murder in America soon, and it's wild.
This abandoned psychiatric hospital was closed due to cruelty towards patients. Let's go and take a look inside. Patients were given electroshock therapy as well as being tied to their beds. Now all that's left is the sadness and the horrors of what took place here. The hospital was called the place of no return, as patients were never allowed to leave and would die within these walls.
He's sorry. Oh, he's sorry. He's sorry. He's sorry. He's sorry. He's sorry. He's sorry.
Just one thing that we have in common. Neither of us will be missed. Saint Bernard sits at the top of the driveway. You always said how you loved us.
These are the abandoned bunkers where the Mothman supposedly lives to this day. Numerous people have reported experiencing strange paranormal events in and around these bunkers in the woods outside of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. We spent a whole day in Point Pleasant interviewing people about the legend of the Mothman, and late one night we headed out to the bunkers to see if we could find the source of the legend ourselves. What we uncovered in this area is groundbreaking and shocking, and we may have proved the existence of the Mothman. The full video's coming tomorrow.
After 65 years, the boy in the box finally has a name. He was found dead and alone in a box in Philadelphia in 1957. He had signs of severe malnourishment, bruising, and scars, and his cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma. After the case went cold, he became known as America's Unknown Child. I've talked about this case in the past, and I'm so glad he finally has a name: Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born January 13th, 1953, although he was never even issued a social security number. Genealogists used his DNA to establish his birth parents, who are now deceased. It's believed that the family was from West Philadelphia, and there are several siblings that are still living. And although it's amazing that he now has a name, the case still remains unsolved. The authorities have suspicions on who possibly murdered Joseph, but they're asking anyone with information to call 215-686.
Explaining the backstory to viral videos.
The tiny room in this video belongs to Elizabeth Fritzl, who was imprisoned by her father Joseph for 24 years. She was locked up in this cellar against her will at the age of 18 and was abused, tormented, and assaulted by her father repeatedly. This abuse led to Elizabeth having 7 children with her father, 3 of which lived with her, and 3 were taken by Joseph and his wife, and 1 he killed shortly after its birth. However, in 2008, one of the children in the cellar became deathly sick, so Joseph was forced to take them to the hospital. She took her only chance to talk to the cops and told them everything. Joseph's charged with the murder of the baby Michael, as well as enslavement, incest, rape, coercion, and false imprisonment. He pled guilty to all charges and is currently serving life.
Both fingers? Perfect. Can you see the shadow? The shadow of your hands, of my hands? Can you see the shadow? Okay, when I say 1, 2, 3. Take your hands away. 1, 2, 3.
The owner of this funeral home was found dead on this floor one morning in 2017 with no obvious cause of death. The neighbors warned me not to enter, as it was filled with espiritus malignos, which means evil spirits. Everything had been left abandoned ever since, even the keys to the luxury cars. The most shocking discovery was yet to come. I found more than 30 boxes of human remains just left behind. Sadly, it seems this place as well as the contents will remain forgotten forevermore.
This man shot his son's abuser in the head live on national TV. Here is the shocking true crime story of Gary Plauché. In 1983, Gary and June Plauché were going through a divorce. To take their 10-year-old son Jody's mind off it, they decided to get him into karate. Jeff Doucette was the local karate teacher who taught Jody, and he quickly hit it off with Gary, and they became friends, and Jeff would often visit Gary and Jody in their home. At first, Jody was thriving in karate, winning tournaments, and this was the perfect distraction from his parents' ongoing divorce. Little did Gary know that Jeff was slowly grooming Jody one touch at a time over the course of several months. For a long period of time, Jeff had established himself as being very close to the family, spending a lot of time with them. So, on February 19th, 1984, Jody's parents didn't see any issue with letting Jeff take Jody back to his home so he could check out the brand new carpet he was getting fitted. Once nighttime arrived, Gary and June were unable to get hold of Jeff, so they began to panic, contact friends and family in regards to where Jeff and Jody could be, but they had completely vanished. After a week went by, Gary and June got a phone call from Jody, who told them they were just in a hotel room near Disneyland, and then Jeff himself jumped on the call and insisted that they bring the whole family to meet them as if nothing had happened, but sadly this wasn't the case. The truth was that he had done unspeakable things to Jody during their time in that hotel room. Thankfully, the FBI were tracking the parents' calls, so when Jeff got in touch, they managed to track down Jeff and Jody not long after that call, and Jeff was swiftly arrested. Understandably, Gary was devastated that he'd allowed this to happen to his son. Drowning his sorrows, he was drinking at a bar one night when he struck up a conversation with an executive from a local news station, who accidentally let slip that police were flying Jeff into Baton Rouge that evening at 9:08 p.m. That was all Jeff needed to hear, and he instantly knew what he had to do. He went straight to the airport, and when Jeff's flight landed, he called a friend to say, "Here he comes, you're about to hear a shot." As you can see, Jeff was being escorted by police through the airport when they begin to pass the payphone, and you can see Jeff in the background in disguise. Nobody had noticed him, nor did they notice him pull out his gun, and within a second, he shot Jeff in the head, live on TV, and he instantly dropped to the ground. The first officer to grab Gary was a friend who can be heard yelling, "Why, Gary, why?" And he replied, "If somebody did it to your kid, you would do it too." In the end, thanks to the strong support of the nation, Gary only spent a few years behind bars before being freed and dying peacefully in 2014. Like and follow for more.
This is Albert Fish, the worst pedophile in American history. Oh yeah, and he was also a serial killer and a cannibal. So after torturing and murdering a number of young children, including Frances McDonald pictured right here, Albert Fish needed to escalate even further in his mind. He was allegedly experiencing psychosis, and he would later tell investigators that he was being told by God that he needed to kill and torture these young kids. And this is what leads us to Grace Budd. So initially, the Budd family had placed a wanted ad in the New York City newspapers that claimed that their son, Edward, wanted a position working out in the country. Albert Fish decided that this was another opportunity to grab another victim, so he paid the Budd family a visit. He would claim later on that he intended on mutilating, torturing, and killing Edward Budd, but when he went to the family's home, he was instead greeted by young 10-year-old Grace. So this is just horrible. This is Grace Budd. Albert was good with talking with people, so when he went to the family's home, he talked to the parents and everything, and then he told them that he had to go visit his niece for her birthday party later that day. And he invited young Grace to come along with him, and shockingly, the family said, "Yes, take her with you." But obviously there was no birthday party, and Albert Fish took Grace Budd to this eerie old house known as Wisteria Cottage, and it was there where he tortured, murdered, and literally consumed her. So after he was done with Grace Budd, Albert Fish went home, and then he actually wrote a letter to the Budd family describing exactly what he had done to their daughter, and it is one of the most disturbing things that I've ever read in my life. I'm going to post an entire TikTok of the letter. Basically, we did a podcast about this story, and we read the whole letter in its entirety a year or so ago, and let me tell you, it is so disturbing. He talks about consuming the body, exactly how he murdered the young girl. He even talks about a friend that cannibalized young boys in another country earlier in life. It's one of the most disturbing things that you will ever read, but I'm going to post another TikTok with that entire audio in it. But that letter would prove to be Albert Fish's downfall. Now, the police were able to trace that letter. They interviewed people, and they determined that Albert Fish was the person who sent the letter. And so they arrested him, brought him in, and that's what blew this whole case open. After his arrest, they also discovered that Albert Fish had murdered another young boy. On February 11th, 1927, 3 young boys were playing in an apartment complex in Brooklyn, and one of them seemingly vanished into thin air. When they asked the other children what had happened to the other young boy, they replied that the boogeyman had taken them. Through investigation, the police were able to determine that Albert Fish was the one that had killed the young boy. And this was the trial of the century. There's so much that I could go into here that I don't have time for. You can listen to our podcast to find out what happened there. But Albert Fish was unrepentant till the very end. He even told investigators after he received the death penalty that frying in the electric chair would be a supreme thrill. I'm not kidding. It's even said that he helped the executioner secure the electrodes onto his own body. So yeah, he was obviously the worst.
This is the real-life story of the possession and exorcism of Anneliese Michel. This is one of the few cases of demonic possession that has ever reached a legal court. Anneliese Michel was a well-behaved girl who grew up in a strict Catholic family in Bavaria, Germany. In 1968, at the age of 16, she suffered a severe epileptic seizure. Over the next few years, she'd be diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy and depression, and she was prescribed medication for this. By 1973, she had also started hallucinating, particularly while praying, and these voices would tell her that she was damned to hell. Anneliese became increasingly aggressive. She would growl, speak in languages her parents said that she didn't know, and on one occasion she even threw her sister across the room. According to her mom, she walked into a room to find Anneliese staring at a cross with black eyes. Anneliese was also seen eating bugs, and on one occasion she peed on the floor and then tried to lick it up. Her mother decided that this wasn't a mental health issue and that her daughter was possessed. Her neurologist also suggested that she needed to be taken to a priest, but then later denied saying this. Her mother took her to several priests who all said that Anneliese needed a medical doctor until she finally found one that gave her permission to do an exorcism. 3 days after her 22nd birthday, Anneliese would receive the first of what would come to be 67 exorcisms. These exorcisms were recorded, and here is a clip of one.
Sie müssen wieder auf der Kanzel predigen, dass mich gibt. Und das Volk nicht entführen. Oh. Ja! Das muss im Volk bewusst gemacht werden.
Anneliese had also stopped eating during this time because she felt that starving herself would weaken the demons. She died in her sleep on July 1st, 1976 at the weight of just 66 pounds. After examining her body, doctors determined that she had passed away due to malnutrition and dehydration. She'd also been suffering from pneumonia, and her kneecaps were broken because she had been kneeling and praying so much. Her death had been investigated as a criminal matter, and they found that as soon as a week before her death, if she had been taken to a hospital, she could have survived. Her parents, along with the 2 priests who performed these exorcisms, were charged with negligent homicide, but they argued that Anneliese had consented to these. They said that she could have said no at any time, but honestly, could she? Also, she was clearly mentally compromised, and they should have made the right decision for her. They also argued that the day before Anneliese passed, the demon was exorcised, and that's why her autopsy came back normal. For what they did to Anneliese, all 4 defendants were found guilty and sentenced to 3 years probation. The details of this case are so scary that it inspired the popular movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose. But who's the real monster here, the devil or an abusive and delusional parent?
Now, a lot of people have been tagging me in this video, so I'm here to explain the backstory to this whole thing. Now, bear with me, this is a very graphic and long breakdown of this whole thing. Now, the little girl you see in this video is named Sandra Canto, who was born on March 8th, 2001. Her parents were named Maria Chavez and Daniel Canto. She lived in a trailer park with her parents, her grandparents, and her 3 older siblings in Tracy, California. Now, Sandra was a really happy, bubbly girl, and she was also very talkative, so she would strike up a conversation with almost everyone. And she was also very helpful around the neighborhood. But things would take a dark turn on March 27, 2009. Sandra had just come back from school, and she was very energetic and happy. So she asked her mother if she could play outside with her friends. Now, in the neighborhood, it's normal for kids to play outside in the park spaces or in their friends' houses, so her mother said yes. Sandra then proceeded to go skipping happily to her friend's house, knocking on their houses. That was the last time Maria saw her daughter alive. It was getting pretty late, and Sandra had not come home yet.
What, she didn't come home for dinner? Or she didn't call me?
Maria was getting worried, so she called Sandra's friends and asked if they seen her. Her friends said that they haven't seen her for hours. Eventually, the police was involved and ordered a search, and even went as far as to offer $20,000 for whoever can find Sandra Canto. At this exact time, Maria had received a text message from her neighbor Melissa McCumchie, something like that. I'm not pronouncing that last name. She had texted her, quote, "Tell the police I lost a suitcase. Don't know if this makes it different or not." Back in the town, they were holding candles and praying for Sandra's safety when all of a sudden a woman burst out crying and screaming and telling the police that she had found a note on her front yard. The note said, and I quote, "Canto locked in stolen suitcase, thrown in water on Buchetti Road and Whitehall Road, witness." Now, this was very off because the note had obvious spelling mistakes, and the woman who reported finding this note was the same woman who texted Maria about the suitcase. Up until this point, they didn't suspect Melissa of anything because she was a mother and she was a Sunday school teacher. Why would she do something like this? Eventually, a farm worker who was walking down that same water path that the note said found the suitcase and called the police. And as expected, Sandra's body was found inside the suitcase. Forensic evidence shows that she had been beaten with a foreign object and smothered to death. They also found traces of Xanax in her system. The police checked security cameras and found that Sandra was making her way to Melissa's house and Melissa leaving in her SUV. Earlier that day, Melissa claimed that she went to the church at 5 and came home at 6:30 p.m. Police investigated the church and found a rolling pin with a bent handle and a brownish reddish stain on the side. The stain tested positive for Sandra's DNA. Now, when they went to arrest Melissa, Melissa tried to unalive herself by swallowing a razor to avoid consequences for her actions. But she made a recovery in the hospital and was quickly discharged. After she was discharged, the police then arrested her and interrogated her. Melissa said that the whole thing was an accident, and she said that Sandra climbed in the suitcase because she was playing hide and seek with her daughter. Melissa didn't know Sandra was hiding in the suitcase and closed it up anyways, and Sandra died of asphyxiation. Melissa was tried and almost given the death penalty, but however, she pleaded guilty and received life in prison without parole. During the whole court trial, Sandra's father burst out crying and said this:
"You took the life of an innocent little girl, and she didn't do nothing. She's not even old enough to decide to eat ice cream yet."
Now, the reason Melissa did this is still unknown. Melissa doesn't even know why she did the whole thing.
I wish I could give you an explanation for what happened. I owe you an explanation. I still cannot understand why I did what I did.
Like and follow for